The contract was sitting on the desk between me and the man who had brought it. Outside the office window, Seattle was doing its November thing. Gray sky, wet streets, people walking fast with their collars turned up. It wasn't really cold yet, but the damp got into your clothes and stayed there. The man held out his hand. Ricky Green. I shook it. His hand was dry and firm, and he let go right away. I went back to the contract. The pay was 3 times what a geologist of my rank usually made. That was the first thing that caught my attention. The second was that there wasn't a destination on the contract. Not a town, not a camp, not even a general region beyond Beaufort Sea drilling site. I'd done enough field work to know that a drilling site usually had to be somewhere you could point to on a map. What part of the Beaufort? I asked. Ricky sat across from me in his gray suit. He had an overcoat folded over one arm and a face that didn't give much away. The contract specifies the Beaufort Sea. That's not a location. It's the location we're authorized to provide. That was the sort of answer that makes a person want to ask the same question again, only slower. I went over the page again. The work was described as an oil shale survey. Geological sampling, stratigraphic analysis. Nothing unusual in the wording. The money was unusual. I tapped the contract with one finger. Why does an oil shale survey need 2 United States Navy icebreakers? Ricky didn't look surprised I'd asked. I'm not at liberty to discuss the logistical decisions. There's also a marine security detachment listed here. Yes. 40 tons of refrigeration machinery. Yes. And transport by C-124 Globemasters. He folded his hands on the desk. The project was approved above my authority. That doesn't answer the question. No, it doesn't. I leaned back in the chair. The office smelled like wet wool and old floor wax. Somewhere down the hall, a telephone rang and kept ringing until somebody finally picked it up. Tell me plainly, I said. What kind of oil shale needs that much military support? Ricky looked at me for a second. The Cold War makes unusual expenditures easy to conceal. That was probably the closest thing to an explanation I was going to get. It wasn't a good explanation. I knew that then. The money mattered, though. I won't pretend it didn't. I had a wife at home and bills that didn't care whether a geological survey made sense. 3 times the normal rate would pay off a few things. It would put something in the bank. It would make the separation worth talking about if I came back with nothing but frozen boots and a stack of boring samples. I signed the contract. The pen felt cheap in my hand. I remember that because I expected something better. A contract worth that kind of money ought to have come with a better pen, or at least a room without water dripping off people's coats. Ricky took the pages and checked my signature. I'll find out what you're looking for, I said. He looked up. I mean before I come back. The assignment is geological. That's what it says. He put the contract into a leather folder. You should limit your questions to the work. I've never been very good at that. No, I hadn't. By the time I got home, Thelma already knew something was wrong. I hadn't told her about the money over the phone. I hadn't told her much of anything, which was probably the problem. She was standing in the kitchen with one hand on the counter and the other holding the contract. I don't know how she'd gotten it. Either way, she had it now. That contract is hiding something, she said. Thelma didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. When she was frightened, she got quieter, not louder, and that was usually worse. It's a drilling position. Where? Up north. That isn't a place. I took off my coat and hung it by the door. The house was warm and quiet, and the coffee had been sitting in the pot too long. I wanted to say it was nothing. I wanted to tell her the military equipment was just paperwork, and the destination was being kept vague because government work was always like that. But she would have heard the lie in it. The contract says Beaufort Sea. The contract says that and nothing else. That's right. She looked at me. Wayne. I hated when she used my name that way. Not because she was angry, because she wasn't. She was waiting for me to stop trying to make a bad explanation sound reasonable. I don't know exactly where it is, I said. How long will you be gone? I don't know that either. She set the contract down on the table. And you're going? The money was part of it. So was the unanswered question. I could have told myself it was just professional curiosity, but that wouldn't have been the whole truth. I wanted to know why anybody would spend that much to look for oil shale in a place where the sea froze solid around the ships. I think I should go, I said. Thelma looked out the window. The glass had fogged around the edges. "You promised me before Christmas." "I'll be back before Christmas. I'll write whenever they let me." She kept looking out the window. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She let me. That was about as much reassurance as either of us had. Ricky drove me to the military airfield the next afternoon. He didn't say much on the way. I guess we were both quiet. The city fell away behind us, and the rain turned to a thin mist against the windshield. At the airfield, the wind came hard across the open tarmac. It smelled like jet fuel and salt water. The Globemaster was parked near the loading area with its rear cargo door open. It was a huge airplane, bigger than any transport I'd been around before, and men were moving equipment into it with forklifts and hand trucks. Drilling machinery went in first. Sections of pipe, crates of tools, coils of heavy cable. Then they started loading the refrigerated cargo. The cases were wooden and painted gray. They weren't marked with what was inside. Each one had a temperature written on the side in black stencil. Below freezing. Some were marked -20. Others were colder than that. I stood there watching a forklift carry one across the wet concrete, the wooden boards white with frost around the edges. I pointed at it. "What's in those?" "Scientific samples," Ricky said. "Samples of what?" "Material recovered during the survey." "Then why don't they have contents marked on them?" Ricky watched the forklift disappear into the cargo hold. "You don't question the warehouse inventory." He sounded like he'd had to repeat that rule before. I looked at the cases again. Scientific samples from a survey that needed icebreakers, marines, 40 tons of refrigeration, and an airplane large enough to carry a house. Maybe it was oil shale. Maybe it wasn't. Ricky checked his watch. "Your personal effects have been loaded," he said. "You should board." I nodded, but I stayed where I was for another moment. The men pushed the last case toward the open cargo door. Frost covered the black temperature marking and made the wood shine under the floodlights. Then I watched the last temperature-marked case disappear into the Globemaster's cargo hold. The flight took most of the day, and I spent it strapped into a canvas seat beside the refrigerated cargo. The airplane was loud enough that talking didn't do much good. Every so often, one of the men would lean over and shout something, and I'd nod whether I understood him or not. The cases were chained to the deck behind us. They had the same gray paint and temperature markings I'd seen on the airfield. Only now the frost had spread over the bands and corners. I tried not to look at them. That didn't work very well. The project used warships, military aircraft, marines, and permanent cold storage equipment to search for something under the Beaufort Sea. It did all of this in weather cold enough to kill a man before anybody could get a doctor to him. Calling it an oil shale survey was getting harder by the hour. I didn't know what they were looking for. I didn't know why it had to be kept frozen. But I meant to find out before I went home to Thelma. The airplane came down late that night on a strip of ice that looked like a road somebody had cleared across the ocean. There were lights along both sides, small yellow lamps half buried in snow. Beyond them was darkness in every direction. The landing gear hit hard enough to throw me against the restraint. A few of the men swore. I didn't. There wasn't much point. The Globemaster rolled to the end of the strip and stopped with the engine still running. The cold came in through the open ramp. It got through my coat right away. My gloves were on, but my fingers started to ache before I reached the ground. There was a military truck waiting beside the ramp. It had wide tracks instead of wheels and a canvas-covered bed. A man in a heavy parka stood beside the cab with one hand on the door. He was broad through the shoulders and had a pale scar running across one eyebrow. He looked at the cargo men, then at me. "You Morgan?" "That's right." "I'm Casey. Get in." He didn't offer his first name. I didn't ask for it. I climbed up into the passenger seat and shut the door. The cab smelled like diesel fuel, wet canvas, and the kind of cold metal smell you get in a machine shop. Casey climbed in beside me and started moving before the door had quite latched. "Station Kelvin is 30 miles from here," he said. "How long does that take?" "Depends on the ice." That wasn't much of an answer, but I found out what he meant soon enough. The truck crawled away from the landing strip, and the treads began to work over the floe. At first, the surface was fairly smooth, just ridges of wind-blown snow and hard blue ice showing through in places. Then we came to the first pressure ridge. It ran across the route like a frozen wave. The truck climbed it slowly, tilted forward, and dropped down the other side. Something under us groaned. The sound wasn't coming from the truck. I could feel that much through the seat. The ice shifted beneath us. Casey kept both hands on the controls. "Don't move around." I wasn't planning to. The flow opened somewhere off to our left. I heard a long cracking sound and saw a dark line appear through the snow. It widened, then closed again as the ice pressed back together. The truck rocked on its tracks but kept going. I watched the surface ahead. The ocean was under us. There was no real road, and no reason to think the next 100 yards would hold any better than the last 100. The only thing keeping us from the water was a sheet of ice and Casey's judgment. We stopped twice. The first time Casey killed the engine and 3 Marines climbed down with poles and tools. They walked around the truck and tested the ice along both sides of the route. One of them knelt beside a split in the flow and leaned over it with a flashlight. "How deep is it?" I asked. Casey looked at him through the windshield. "Deep enough." The Marine stood up and waved them back. Casey started the engine and turned the truck slightly to the east. We went around the split. The second stop came after a ridge caught something underneath the truck. There was a sharp metallic bang, and then the smell of fuel came into the cab. Casey shut down the motor. One of the Marines crawled under the front while another held a light. They worked for several minutes. I could hear tools striking metal and the wind pushing against the canvas behind us. "Damaged fuel line," Casey said. "Can it be repaired?" "It can be repaired enough." That was what they did. One man came out with oil on his gloves and a strip of rubber in his hand. They wrapped it around the line and tightened it with a clamp. Casey started the engine and watched the gauge for a while. "Route holds," one of the Marines said. Casey nodded and put the truck in motion. The drill derricks appeared before I could see the station itself. They stood ahead of us under yellow work lights that made the snow look dirty. There were 3 of them, tall metal frames with cables hanging down into the ice. The lights stayed on even though there was no real day left to turn into night. 2 icebreakers were frozen into the flow beyond the derricks. Their dark hulls rose out of the ice at an angle, surrounded by towers and cables. They looked less like ships than buildings that had been trapped during construction. Station Kelvin spread out between them and the drilling rigs. There were several low huts, fuel tanks, equipment sheds, and a warehouse set apart from everything else. The warehouse was sealed. I knew that before we reached it because nothing moved around the building. No men went in or out. There were no crates stacked beside the door and no equipment leaning against the walls. The compressors were running continuously, though, and their vibration came through the ice. We stopped near the door. A guard stepped out of a small shelter and raised one hand. "Nobody goes in there." I climbed down from the truck. The cold had stiffened my legs during the ride, and I stood there for a second until they started working again. "What's inside?" "Refrigerated samples." "I've seen the cases." "Then you know what they are." "I know what the temperature markings say." The guard didn't seem interested in the difference. "Johnny Black has forbidden anyone outside the physics team to enter the warehouse." "Who is Johnny Black?" The guard looked toward the main hut. "He'll tell you." I looked at the warehouse door. Frost was forming around the seals even with the compressors running. Warm air came out of vents above the door and disappeared into the cold in a thin white stream. Casey gave the guard a look and climbed back into the truck. I followed him. We drove the short distance to the main hut. A man was waiting outside. He was thin and pale, with silver blonde hair brushed back from his forehead and rimmed glasses that caught the yellow light. He wore a white laboratory coat under his cold weather gear. His hands were shaking, though he kept one of them closed around the other to hide it. "Wayne Morgan?" he asked. "Yes, I'm Johnny Black." He said it like that settled the introduction. "I understand you're the geologist." "That's what the contract says." He looked at me for a moment. "You will examine the core from the deepest borehole." "Why that one?" "The deposit is there." He turned and went inside. I followed because there wasn't any reason not to, and because I wanted to hear him say something that made sense. The main hut was warmer than the truck, but not warm enough to feel comfortable. There was a table covered with maps and drilling logs. Black picked up a folder and handed it to me. "The deposit is all you need to know," he said. "That isn't enough." "It will have to be." Casey came in behind me and shut the door. He took off his gloves and placed them on the table. "Armed perimeter is in place," he said. "The drilling schedule starts at 6. You don't leave the station without clearance." Where are the cores? Storage hut, east side. You'll be shown. Casey looked at me. Nobody goes onto the central water without an escort. I stared at him. The central water? There's open water inside the flow. How? That isn't your concern. It was the second time that day somebody had told me what wasn't my concern. I was beginning to get a list. Casey continued. You stay with the work party. You follow the route markers. You don't approach the water alone. I looked down at it. Black had written the borehole number across the front in a narrow, careful hand. Outside, the compressors started another cycle and the sound came through the walls. The radio operator came in while I was still looking at the borehole number. He had a headset over one ear and a pencil in his hand. The pencil was worn down almost to the metal. He looked at Casey. Overland convoy approaching from the west, he said. They've crossed the outer lead. Casey picked up the field binoculars from the table. How many vehicles? 5, maybe 6. I can't see the last one through the snow. Any markings? Negative. Casey looked at me. Stay here. I'd rather see who's coming. Then stay behind me. He put on his gloves and went out through the door. I followed him. Outside, the wind had picked up and was blowing snow across the station lights. The drilling rigs stood out in the dark like unfinished towers. Somewhere beyond them, the compressors were running, and the warehouse gave off the same steady vibration I'd felt through the hut floor. A group of Marines was gathered beside the equipment shed. They were carrying rifles from an open case and checking the magazines under the yellow lights. Nobody was talking much. They didn't look frightened. That was probably because they had more practice at being frightened without showing it. Casey stopped beside them. Load rifles, he said. No firing unless the convoy crosses the marked boundary. One of the Marines looked toward the western lead. What if they don't stop? They stop or we stop them. Nobody fires unless they cross. Yes, sir. Casey turned to the radio operator. Mark the boundary and keep the channel open. The operator went back inside. Casey started west across the ice with the binoculars hanging from one hand. I went after him. He didn't tell me to stay back, which I took as permission, or maybe he just didn't notice I was there. The western boundary was marked by short poles driven into the ice. There was a rope between them with pieces of red cloth tied every few feet. It seemed like a poor way to mark a line if somebody really intended to defend it, but I suppose most lines look poor until somebody crosses them. The lead beyond the boundary was black open water. It wasn't wide, maybe 30 feet at the narrowest point. Steam or blowing frost hung over it and moved in the wind. On the other side, headlights came toward us through the snow. The convoy stopped before it reached the opposite edge. There were 6 vehicles after all. 2 tracked carriers, a fuel truck, a flatbed loaded with drilling pipe, and 2 smaller trucks with equipment under canvas. A drill mast had been strapped down on the flatbed. Even from that distance, I could see the metal frame and the heavy cables. They hadn't come to look around. Casey raised the binoculars. He studied the convoy for a few seconds, then lowered them. Who are they? I asked. Competition. That doesn't tell me much. It tells you enough. A man climbed down from the first carrier and walked to the edge of the water. His shoulders were broad, and he wore a heavy parka with a fur-lined cap pulled low over his ears. He had a strong face and a way of standing that made the rest of the convoy look like it belonged to him. Casey stepped closer to the marked line. Identify yourself, he called. The man looked across the lead. You identify first. This is Station Kelvin. You are outside our boundary. We're aware of that. State your name and command. The man glanced back at the vehicles, then faced us again. His voice carried well over the water. Bryson Ellis, Western Expedition Command. That was how I got his name. Not from an introduction or a file. He shouted it across a strip of black water like a challenge. Casey lifted the binoculars again and looked at the drilling equipment. What are you doing here, Ellis? Drilling. This claim is occupied. Kelvin does not own this ice. Casey's jaw tightened. You will remain on your side of the boundary. We're not on your side. That's the rule. We are drilling to the same depth. Casey looked at me. You hear that? I heard him. Ellis called across the lead. We were sent to reach the target before you do. So were we, Casey said. That was the problem. There wasn't much else to say after that. Both crews had come to the same piece of ice with the same instructions. Nobody was going to turn around because the other side had arrived first. Ellis pointed toward the drill mast on the flatbed. "Tell Casey we will not withdraw." "I heard him," Casey said. Ellis turned away and began giving orders to his crew. The men started unloading equipment. They didn't cross the boundary, but they didn't go anywhere either. We stayed there for another few minutes. The wind pushed snow across the lead and the open water steamed faintly in the dark. It was strange to stand on solid ice and look at water that should have been frozen. Stranger still to see men setting up a drill on the other side, as though the water between us was a fence. Casey lowered the binoculars. "They'll start drilling as soon as they can," he said. "Can they drill through the boundary?" "Not without crossing it." "Can they reach the same depth from there?" "That's what they're here to find out." He walked back toward the station. I followed him. The rival convoy remained on the western ice through the night. They ran their lights and worked under them. Every so often we heard an engine start or saw men moving around the drill equipment. No shots were fired. Nobody crossed the red line. I tried to sleep in the main hut and didn't do much of it. There were too many sounds. The compressors never stopped. The radio crackled at irregular intervals. Men opened and closed the door. Once, sometime after midnight, a long metallic groan came from the western side, and I sat up. The station was between two things that didn't make sense. The rival convoy was outside the marked boundary, and the warehouse was full of samples that kept getting warmer in a place where everything else froze. I didn't like either one. At first light, Casey came to get me. The light wasn't much. It spread across the horizon in a flat gray band and made the snow easier to see without making the darkness go away. Casey had the binoculars again. I didn't ask where he'd been. "Come on," he said. "Where?" "Center Basin." I put on my gloves and followed him across the floe. The rigs and trucks were still where we'd left them. In daylight, the central area looked less like a station and more like a construction site built on the wrong part of the ocean. Then I saw the basin. It was almost perfectly circular. The ice formed a white ring around it, smooth in some places, and broken into pressure ridges in others. The circle was about half a mile across. The surrounding floe supported the drilling rigs, the trucks, the fuel tanks, and the buildings. Inside the ring there was nothing but open water. No sea ice at all. The Beaufort Sea around us was frozen solid and carried heavy machinery. The wind had crusted the snow and packed it into ridges. The water inside the circle was black and moving gently against the edge. A thin mist hung above it. "How long has it been open?" I asked. Casey looked through the binoculars toward the western lead. "Long enough." "That doesn't answer the question." "Black can answer it." Johnny was waiting near the basin with two men in insulated gear. I knew one of them from the main hut, though I didn't know his name. The other was younger and thinner, with light brown hair sticking out from under his cap. He kept looking at the water and then looking away. Johnny came toward us. "The perimeter ends here," Casey said. "I can see that. Stay behind the markers." The markers were set well back from the water. There was a narrow path between them where people had been walking, but nobody had gone close to the edge. Johnny took me along that path while Casey stayed behind with the binoculars. The closer we got, the more obvious the warmth became. My face was still cold from the wind, but the air above the water felt different. Not warm exactly, just less cold. The mist lifted from the surface in thin strands and vanished before it rose very high. Johnny stopped me before the edge. "The water is warmer than the surrounding Beaufort Sea water." He gave the answer in a flat voice. That was probably how he had learned to say things that should have sounded impossible. "How much warmer?" "Enough." "That isn't a measurement." He looked at me. His hands had started shaking again, and he closed one around the other. "The instruments are being lowered now." The younger physicist set up a tripod beside the marker line. A cable ran from it to a metal instrument case. He checked the connections twice, then began lowering a probe toward the water. The cable went down slowly. Nobody spoke while he watched the readings. The second man wrote numbers on a clipboard. After a few minutes, the younger one pulled the probe back up. He looked at the instrument, then at Johnny. "Record it," Johnny said. The man wrote something down. "Every hour," Johnny said. "Same depth." The physicist nodded. He looked paler than he had a minute before, though that might have been the light. The younger man with the messy hair was the one who had been looking away from the basin. He put the instrument back in its case and kept his hands there. "What are their names?" I asked Johnny. Cody Jensen is the younger one. Cody looked over when he heard his name. He didn't say anything. The other physicist picked up the case and carried it back toward the hut. The readings continued through the morning. Every hour the instruments went down. Every hour they came back up. The physicists wrote down the temperature and checked it against the previous reading. They became quieter as the day went on. Their faces seemed to lose color under the hoods and goggles. By the third reading, one of them was holding the clipboard so tightly his fingers had gone white. Cody didn't eat lunch. There was food in the main hut, and people were eating it standing up. Cody sat at the end of the table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He never drank it. He kept whispering numbers to himself and writing figures on the sleeve of his parka. I asked him what the numbers meant. He stopped writing. "Nothing," he said. That wasn't true, but it was the answer he was willing to give with Johnny nearby. Later, he found me at the storage hut. He closed the door behind him and carried a small metal container in both hands. It was sealed with a clamp and marked with a borehole number. "The core samples are from below 2 miles of ice and rock," he said. I looked at the container. Moisture had formed on the outside of it. The drops were not frozen. They ran down the metal and collected along the bottom edge. "How long have they been out of the warehouse?" "Not long." I touched the side with one gloved finger. It was warmer than the table. "Why are warm samples in a refrigerated warehouse?" Cody looked toward the door. "I think the samples continued warming after removal." "Continued warming to what?" He shook his head. "Tell me plainly." "Black ordered them frozen before they changed further." "What does changed mean?" Cody didn't answer. He set the sample container on the cold table and left it there. The next 2 days passed with the station running around the clock. Nobody got much sleep. The rigs kept drilling through the dark, and the compressors kept the warehouse cold. Men ate when they could and slept wherever they found an empty bunk. Cody stopped eating altogether. He'd sit at the table's far end, coffee beside him, and write numbers on his parka sleeve. They weren't the numbers going into the official log. I asked him about it the first night. "What do they mean?" Cody stopped writing. His eyes went to the closed door. "Nothing. That isn't true. I think it's just a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" He shook his head. "I can't explain it yet." He went back to writing. I could have pressed him, but Johnny was in the next room and Cody had already made it clear he didn't want to talk where anybody might hear him. Whatever he was seeing had scared him. That was enough for me to leave him alone for the time being. Stephen found me outside the following afternoon. The wind had dropped and the station looked almost peaceful. The rigs were still working and the rival convoy was still on the western ice. Nothing had improved. It was just quieter. "You were asking about the basin," he said. "I've been asking about it since I got here. 2 men went onto it before you arrived." I looked at him. "For what?" "Inspection." "Did they go alone?" "Negative." He made the word sound final. There were 2 men in the party, along with a line crew and a guard. They went out on the warm water to check the edge of the basin. The ice there was thin in places and solid in others. Nobody knew why. The men made it about halfway across before the surface gave way under them. "Did they fall through?" I asked. "That's what it looked like." "Then where are they?" Stephen watched the rigs. They didn't come back up. The basin was half a mile across, and there was nowhere for 2 men to hide. They'd searched the water with lines and lights. They hadn't found bodies. They hadn't found clothing or equipment either. "Nobody goes onto the warm water," he said. "Nobody drills alone. Those are the rules." "What about the other side?" "Ellis is the other side. I mean, if his rig reaches the target first." Stephen turned toward me. "Kelvin loses its advantage." "What advantage?" He gave me a hard look. "The one you're standing on." That wasn't an answer, but it was probably as close as I was going to get from him. Black had a reason for keeping the borehole secret. Stephen knew what it was, or knew enough to be worried about it. The rest of us were expected to work around the missing parts. The radio operator called us in before I could ask anything else. Ellis's convoy had repaired its lead drill. They'd replaced part of the drive assembly and were preparing to start boring within a few hours. Stephen listened to the report without saying much. Then he gave the order that all 3 Kelvin rigs would operate around the clock. I took the first rig. The borehole had the best return line, and it was the one Black cared about most. I had no idea what Black expected to find at the bottom, but I knew my job was to identify changes in the rock as they came up. That made me more useful there than anywhere else on the station. I accepted the night shift because I wanted the access to the borehole. That was the official reason. The other reason was that I didn't trust Black to let anybody see what came up unless they were standing close enough to put a hand on it. The rig shook through the night. The motor had a deep, steady sound that came up through the platform and into my boots. Every so often, the drillers slowed it down and checked the pressure. Most of the returns looked like the material I'd been seeing all day: gray rock, crushed shale, frozen mud. Then the first deep return came up. The line crew poured it into the tray, and I picked up a piece with my gloved hand. It wasn't hot. It wasn't even warm enough to feel through the glove right away, but it wasn't frozen. I held it longer. The rock stayed warm. I checked the thermometer twice. It showed a temperature above freezing. I replaced the thermometer and checked it against another one from the tool cabinet. Both gave the same reading. One of the drillers watched me. Bad instrument? Maybe. I took an unopened sample from the storage box. It had been kept beside the rig where the air was below freezing. The sample was hard enough that I had trouble breaking the paper seal with my gloves. I put the old core beside it on the tray. The frozen sample stayed cold. The new rock didn't. I pressed them together. The cold sample began to sweat along its surface where it touched the warm core. The water froze a moment later, but the rock itself stayed warm. The drilling fluid was cold. The return line was cold. The tray was cold. The warmth was coming from the rock. I walked the sample to Black. He was in the physics hut with Cody and another technician. A set of instruments covered the table. Cody was writing numbers on his sleeve again. "Look at this," I said. Black took the piece from me. His hands were shaking badly enough that he almost dropped it. He steadied them against the table and looked at the core. "Seal it," he said. "It's warm at depth. Seal it and move it to the warehouse. I want to compare it with the earlier samples. You are not authorized to examine the previous samples. Then authorize it." Black looked at me through his glasses. "The deposit is all you need to know. That's not a measurement. It is the decision." I held out my hand. "Give me the earlier samples." "No." He put the warm rock into a metal container and fastened the clamp himself. His fingers trembled while he did it, but he didn't ask for help. When he was finished, he handed it to the technician. "Warehouse," he said. The technician carried it out. I watched the door close behind him. Black kept looking at the table. He knew what the rock meant. Maybe he didn't know why it was warm, but he knew it wasn't supposed to be. That was the part that bothered me. Black kept issuing instructions. The second rig started having trouble before dawn. The return line brought up water mixed with the drilling mud. It wasn't much at first, just a thin green color running through the gray slurry. I leaned over the tray and smelled it. It wasn't petroleum. Oil has a sharp smell that stays in the back of your throat. This was different. Faint and sweet and rotten at the same time. It smelled alive. "Shut the pump down," I said. The driller looked at me. "Why?" "There's something in the intake." He stopped the motor. The mud pump coughed twice and quit. When they opened the housing, there was a thin green residue packed around the valves. It stretched between the metal parts like wet thread. Nobody wanted to touch it. They dismantled the intake and scrubbed the valves with hot water and rags. The green stuff came off, but it left a stain behind. After an hour, they put the pump back together and started again. The return line ran clear for a while. Then the green came back. I went to the radio hut and wrote Thelma a note. I told her the work was dangerous and that I was alive. I didn't write where I was. I didn't even write the province. Ricky had made that rule plain, and I'd promised I wouldn't break it. The supply pilot read the note and handed it back. "I can't carry this." "Why not?" "Unapproved message. It's for my wife." "I understand that." "Then carry it." He shook his head. "I need clearance." There wasn't any point arguing with him. I folded the paper and put it inside my field notebook between 2 pages of rock descriptions. Thelma would get the truth when I got home. I decided that much. If they wouldn't let me send evidence of where I'd been, I'd carry it back myself. That night, Black had a hydrophone lowered down the active borehole. The instrument hung from a cable and disappeared into the dark water below the drill string. Cody watched the monitor while Black stood beside him. I stayed at the first rig controls because the motor was still running and somebody had to keep it there. At first, the hydrophone picked up the usual noise, metal vibration. cable movement, the low grinding sound of the drill working through the rock. Then another sound appeared underneath it. It was slow and regular, a pulse. The needle moved across the display and returned. Then it moved again. Each beat came at the same interval. I could hear it through the speaker as a dull thump that was almost too low to be called a sound. Black leaned toward the monitor. "Vibration through the drill string," he said. He couldn't keep his hand still. "Maybe," I said. He looked at me. "It is the most likely explanation." The rig stopped for inspection. The pulse stopped too. Nobody said anything. The station seemed suddenly much larger without the motors running. The compressors were still going and the wind was pushing against the walls, but the deep sound was gone. Black ordered the first rig restarted. I opened the throttle and brought the motor back up. The platform began to shake under my boots. The pulse returned with the restarting drill motor while Cody watched me instead of the official log. The pulse came back with the motor and got louder than before. At first I thought it was the speaker. With the hydrophone still connected, a dull, steady thump came through the rig controls. But then the platform started shaking under my boots in the same rhythm. The motor would strain, settle, and strain again. Every time it did, the pulse answered from below. Cody stood beside the monitor in the physics hut. He wasn't looking at the official readings anymore. He was watching the line move across the screen. "That's not vibration from the drill," he said. Black kept his eyes on the display. "It is a vibration transmitted through the drill string." "Then why does it stop when the motor stops?" Black didn't answer him. Someone called from the communications hut before I could say anything. His voice came through the open door and carried across the platform. "Western convoy has reached a harder layer." Casey came out of the hut with his gloves half on. "How hard?" "Harder than anything above it. Their bit is holding, but the pressure is climbing." Casey watched the western lead. There wasn't much to see through the blowing snow. A few lights showed on the other side of the basin. The rest of the convoy was hidden in darkness. "Tell them to keep going," he said. The man at the radio looked at him. "Their equipment may not take it. Then they can repair it." Casey turned toward the rigs. "Keep Kelvin drilling. Ignore damage unless the rig becomes unsafe." That wasn't the kind of order anybody wanted to hear while standing on a platform that was shaking beneath them. The drillers looked at each other, then went back to their controls. The motors climbed in pitch. The pulse kept time with them. The rig cooling system failed sometime after that. It started with steam coming out of the housing near the logging equipment. The temperature gauge climbed into the red and the motor began to smell hot. One of the drillers shut the feed down and called for a replacement unit, but there wasn't one available. The supply parts were in the warehouse or on the next convoy. Nobody seemed certain which. I opened the side panel and found the cooling line split near the coupling. The metal had cracked clean through. There was a roll of insulated hose in the geological equipment case and some clamps in the toolbox. It wasn't the right repair. It was just the repair we had. I cut out the broken section and joined the line with the hose. My gloves made the work slow. The metal was hot enough to burn through them, and the platform kept jumping under my feet. I tightened the first clamp, then the second one. When I started the pump again, the hose bulged but held. The driller watched the gauge. "Good enough?" he asked. "It has to be." I brought the logging equipment back online and checked the return signal. It flickered twice and settled. The rig was still running. That was all I needed from it. The other two rigs were still drilling. Their motors had begun to shudder too. The sound came through the ice and into the platform. 3 pulses at once would have been confusing if they hadn't been so close together. One would start and the others would follow. It sounded like something below us was trying to answer all 3. Black came out of the physics hut. "How deep?" he asked. 8,800 feet on the first rig. "And the others?" "Within a few feet." He looked at the repaired cooling line. "Can it continue?" "It can continue." "Then continue." That was Black's answer to most things. If something broke, he wanted to know if it could keep going. If it could, the rest of the question didn't matter. The pulse grew louder as the bits went down. It wasn't loud enough to hurt my ears, but I could feel it in my chest. The logging instruments trembled in their brackets. The needle on the hydrophone display moved farther with every beat. I kept one hand on the controls and watched the pressure rise. Johnny stood beside me with his hands locked together. "Tell me plainly," I said. "What are we drilling into?" He glanced at Casey. Casey was at the edge of the platform, watching the western lights. Black adjusted his glasses. The deposit. That's not what I asked. It is the correct term. What is below us? He was quiet for a moment. The pulse came through the speaker. Cody was still inside the physics hut and had stopped writing. Black looked tired. His hands shook again. The first expedition reached approximately 9,000 feet, he said. They encountered an open cavity beneath the ice and rock. Open cavity? Yes. An empty space? I did not say empty. The motor shuddered. I eased the pressure back a little and watched the gauge fall. How big is it? We don't know. You reached it before. We grazed it. That was the first useful thing he'd said all night. I looked at the depth gauge. We were getting close to 9,000 feet. The rock coming up from the return line had already started to change. Small pieces were warm when I picked them up. The deeper ones stayed warm longer. I didn't need Black to tell me what that meant. The cavity was warm, he said. He still called it the deposit. How warm? Warm enough to affect the samples. What samples? Black watched the warehouse. Behind it, compressors ran while frost collected around the sealed doors. The refrigerated warehouse contains material from the first expedition. Old cores? Samples. How many people were on that expedition? He looked down at his hands. Several scientists died after handling them. The motors kept running. Nobody moved. How did they die? I cannot say. You can say. You just don't want to. Black's face tightened. The deposit is not to be handled. That's not an answer. It is the instruction. I wanted the old core records. I wanted the temperatures, the depth marks, and the names of whoever had logged the material before it went into the warehouse. I wanted something that wasn't Black standing there telling me the deposit was all I needed to know. Give me the records. No. Then tell me what happened to the samples. I have told you enough. He turned away from me, but I stepped in front of him. Keep every core frozen, he said. If the temperature changes, you report it immediately. That's your order? Yes. Why? He looked past me toward the drill controls. Because the samples must remain contained. That was as close as he came to explaining anything. Cody came out of the physics hut carrying a small case under his coat. He had the hydrophone record inside it. I knew that because I'd seen him make the copy earlier, when he thought nobody was watching. He moved quickly toward the communications hut with his head down. Casey saw him. Cody. Cody stopped. Where are you going? I need to transmit the record. You need clearance. I think the record should be sent. Casey walked across the platform. Cody took one step back. He looked young in the yellow light and too thin for the parka he was wearing. Give me the case, Casey said. Cody held it tighter. The pulse is not from the motor. I heard it. Then you know. I know you're not leaving this station with unauthorized material. Cody turned his eyes to the dark basin. People should know what it is. Nobody is leaving. Casey took the case from him. Cody didn't fight, but his hand stayed on it until Casey pulled it free. Then Casey directed him into the physics quarters and shut the door behind him. I followed Casey to the communications hut. You can't lock him up because he's frightened. I'm not keeping him prisoner. I'm keeping that thing contained. He's a scientist. He's an unauthorized departure risk. He's scared. That doesn't change the rule. I looked back at the rigs. The pulse was louder now and all three motors were shaking in it. The ice beneath us felt less like a platform and more like a lid. Ellis's crew is already racing us, Casey said. An unauthorized departure exposes the basin to both sides. He said it like there wasn't anything else to argue about. Maybe it did. The Western convoy had reached the same depth from the other side and they were still drilling. There was no way to know what they would do if they reached the cavity first. Someone called from inside the hut. Western convoy reports 8,900 feet. Casey picked up the handset. Black. Johnny came over from the rig. His face had gone pale. Authorize maximum pressure on all three rigs, Casey said. The motors rose together. The platform shook harder. Casey turned toward the crews. Maximum pressure, he ordered. Keep drilling. The motors rose together. The sound got bigger, but the drilling didn't get any faster. The gauges climbed and the platforms shook against my boots. I kept one hand on the feed control and watched the torque needle jump across the dial. Black stood beside me. Continue. I am continuing. The Western convoy is at the same depth. I heard the report. He turned toward the physics hut. Cody was in there with the hydrophone record and the other two physicists. Casey stood at the platform's edge, watching the western lights through the snowfall. The drill string groaned below us. It was a deep metal sound, and it came through the ice as much as it came through the rig. I eased the feed down a little so the bit wouldn't bind. The pressure went up anyway. The return line started coughing. At first I thought we'd hit another pocket of water. That had happened before, though not with the pressure this high. The line shook against its clamps and a thin gray spray came out of the joint. Then the smell reached me. It smelled like wet leaves, not the rotten green residue we'd found in the pump. This was clean. It smelled like soil and pine needles and something growing. The air coming from the line was warm through my glove. I looked at the return tray. There was no rock in it, no oil, no drilling mud, just a clear stream of water running off the edge and spreading across the metal. Black. He came closer. What is it? Air. He put his hand over the line. His fingers shook when he pulled them back. Continue drilling, he said. There's open space below us. Continue. If the hole collapses, Ellis reaches the cavity first. He didn't say it like a reason. He said it like I'd missed something obvious. I checked the torque gauge. The needle was still moving, but the movement had changed. The pressure had been climbing hard. Now it was starting to fall. We're through, I said. Black turned toward me. How deep? The depth counter clicked over one number at a time. The drill string kept sinking, though the motor wasn't feeding it down anymore. 8,998. Casey joined us on the platform. Shut it down if it's unsafe. I know. Wayne. I watched the counter. 9,000. The torque gauge went slack. The drill string dropped free beneath the platform. There was a loud metallic bang from somewhere below us, and then the cable ran out faster than the feed could take it. The motor whined when the weight came off the bit. I hit the shutoff. Shut down, I yelled. The driller beside me reached for the main control. I pulled the emergency lever and the rig started winding down. The three motors were still running on the other platforms, but ours lost its deep vibration first. The sound fell away in stages. The warm air kept coming out of the borehole. It rose through the opening in a steady stream and moved across the drill floor. The smell got stronger. Green things, wet bark, a forest in summer. I hadn't smelled anything like it since I left home, and even then it wouldn't have been that strong. It was the smell of a place that had been growing without anybody around to see it. The men on the platform started shivering. One of the drillers wrapped his arms around himself. The other bent over and put both hands on his knees. The air around us wasn't cold anymore, but their teeth were chattering. I felt a tremor go through my own legs and had to keep my hand on the control panel. Inside the physics hut, somebody knocked over a chair. Two of the physicists came out and sat down on the ice. They didn't seem to know they'd done it. One of them had his hands pressed against his face. The other was crying without making any noise. Cody made it as far as the control panel. He put one hand on the edge of it and looked down into the open borehole. Then his knees folded and he went down beside the panel. His glasses fell off and landed in the snow. "Cody?" Casey said. Cody didn't answer. The pulse had changed. It wasn't the steady thump we'd heard through the hydrophone. That was gone with the motor. What replaced it was a low note that started deep and rose slowly in pitch. It came from beneath the drill floor. The machinery had stopped. The cable had stopped moving. The pumps were off. There wasn't anything left on the rig that could make that sound, but it continued anyway. I felt it in the platform and in my boots. Casey looked at Black. "What did you open?" Black didn't answer. He went into the physics hut. I watched him move between the instruments. His hands shook so badly he had to stop once and brace himself against the table. Then he opened a cabinet and took out a microphone in a metal housing with a long cable wound around it. He carried it to the edge of the widened borehole. "We need to know whether the cavity is stable," he said. Casey stepped in front of him. "No." Black looked at him. "We need a reading. You are not lowering anything into that hole. The earlier expedition failed because it listened without understanding what was below." Casey glanced down at the borehole. Warm air moved around his boots and lifted the loose snow in little circles. "Then don't make the same mistake. Black held the microphone out toward me. Wayne can lower it. Casey took the cable from Black before I could reach for it. He checked the metal housing and the clamp at the end. Slowly, he said. You stop if I tell you to stop. I took the cable from him. It was heavier than it looked and warm from Black's hands. The microphone hung below the opening. I could see nothing down there. The borehole was black past the first few feet, and the air rising out of it blurred the light from the work lamps. Lower it, Casey said. I let the cable run through my gloves. The note beneath us rose with it. I stopped. The sound stopped rising. I lowered another foot. The note rose again. It wasn't louder exactly. It was closer. The cable moved through my hands and the microphone descended into the open space below the ice. Nothing came through the speaker at first. Just a faint hiss and the sound of the air around the instrument. I lowered it farther. The hiss changed. It became something like breathing, not regular breathing. More like a room full of air moving through leaves. Cody lifted his head from the ice. His face was pale and wet. Don't, he said. I looked at him. Don't what? He shook his head. He didn't seem to know what he was answering. Black was watching the cable. Casey stood beside me with one hand near the control lever and the other resting on the pistol at his hip. I lowered the microphone another few feet. The note rose again. There were no words coming from the speaker. I could hear the hiss and the vibration and something underneath both of them, but it wasn't a voice in the ordinary sense. Then I heard it inside my own head. It wasn't like somebody speaking in the room. It didn't come through my ears. The words were just there. It said it had been placed beneath the ice as a jailer's burden. It was older than the ice. The cold had held it. The drilling had opened its prison. I nearly dropped the cable. The microphone kept hanging in the dark. The speaker gave a low burst of static and then went quiet again. What did you hear? Black asked. I didn't answer right away. The thing below us had not sounded angry. That was what bothered me. It had sounded tired. Not tired the way a man gets tired after work. Tired like something that had been waiting so long it had forgotten what waiting was for. What did you hear? Black asked again. The same thing you did? He looked at me. His glasses had fogged at the edges. How do you know what I heard? I don't. The words came through the speaker then, though they still didn't sound like words. They arrived in my thoughts and in Black's at the same time, placed beneath the ice, older than the ice, held by the cold. Casey grabbed the cable. Pull it up. I held onto it. Wait. Pull it up. The sound under the platform changed again. The note climbed and then dropped back down. The microphone moved in my hand even though I wasn't lowering it. Black reached for the cable too. Do not pull it out. Casey looked at him. You said you needed to know if it was stable. I know what I said. Then bring it back. Black didn't answer him. He kept looking down into the borehole. The cavity is the deposit, he said. I pulled the microphone up a little. The sound rose in response. I stopped and held it there. The cable trembled between my hands. Black's face had gone white. I never learned whether reaching it would release what was inside or destroy it. The cable jumped in my hands. The note beneath us had become a vibration strong enough to shake the drill floor. Tools slid across the platform and fell through the gaps. One of the drillers grabbed the control panel and held on, but the panel tore loose from its brackets and pulled him down with it. The borehole walls started coming apart. Heated rock came up through the opening in chunks. Some of it struck the platform and broke apart. The pieces were dark and wet, with steam coming off them. One hit a Marine in the shoulder and knocked him against the rig housing. Casey turned toward the men. Cut the power. Get everybody to the ladders. The Marines moved, but the drill floor was already shaking too hard for anybody to move normally. Men fell into the machinery. One of them got as far as the ladder and went down on his knees. Another reached for him and lost his balance when the platform jumped. I pulled the microphone cable up and dropped it beside the controls. Black looked at me. The instrument is still receiving. I know. The response is continuing. Johnny, we need to get off this floor. He looked down into the borehole. The warm air was coming out faster now, and the sound under it had changed to something deeper. It went through my chest and made my teeth ache. The microphone is the only instrument still receiving, he said. Casey grabbed him by the arm. Move. Black pulled free. I am not leaving the drill floor. That wasn't a request. The deposit is communicating. Casey looked at the open shaft and then back at him. Move now. Black shook his head. His glasses had slipped down his nose and he couldn't push them back up because his hands shook so badly. He didn't look frightened exactly. He had finally found what he'd spent his whole life looking for, and nothing else mattered to him. I knew that look. Maybe not that exact look, but I knew what it meant. Johnny, I said. He turned toward me. Take the hydrophone records if you survive. I wanted to tell him he could take them himself. I wanted to grab him and drag him toward the ladder, but another piece of heated rock came out of the shaft and struck the platform between us. The metal buckled under it. Casey was already shouting at the Marines. Leave the huts, everybody to the pad. The pulse hit again. It wasn't just coming through the floor anymore. The whole basin seemed to move with it. The lights to the west vanished and came back through a cloud of steam. One of the remaining rigs leaned to the side and stayed there. I looked across the lead with the binoculars hanging from Casey's chest. He lifted them and faced west. The convoy across the basin had stopped transmitting. That had happened during the pulse, though I hadn't heard the report. The lights around their rig were still on. Through the snow, I could make out men standing beside the machinery. Bryson was one of them. I knew him by the broad shape of his parka and the way he stood with his feet spread apart. He and the rest of the crew were frozen in place. None of the vehicles moved. There was no radio call, no engine noise, nothing. Casey lowered the binoculars. They're gone, he said. Dead? I don't know. The ice broke between us and them. A long section of the basin opened with a deep roar. Black water appeared through the snow. Steam rolled across the basin and hid the lights on the far side. More ice broke away around Kelvin. The edge of the basin widened toward the station and took the nearest equipment shed with it. Casey pointed toward the huts. Pad, move. I ran for the physics hut. The drill floor bucked under my feet. I fell against the door and got it open with my shoulder. Cody was on the floor beside the table. His glasses were still gone and blood ran from the side of his head where he'd struck something. Cody. He looked at me. The case. The case is with Casey. He reached toward the instruments instead. I grabbed him under the arm and pulled him upright. He was conscious, but his legs didn't work right. I got him as far as the doorway and left him with 2 Marines who had come back for the people in the hut. Take him to the pad, I said. What about you? I've got the records. I went to the table. The hydrophone reels were still there, along with Cody's handwritten readings. He'd written them on loose sheets and on the sleeves of his parka. Some of the ink had run where the paper was wet, but the numbers were still readable. Depth, temperature, pulse interval. I put the reels in one case and shoved the papers into my field notebook. The notebook was already full of rock descriptions and the note I'd written to Thelma. I didn't have room for any of it, but I made room. The hut lurched before I got out. A shelf came off the wall and struck the table. The instruments dropped into the floor. I carried the case toward the pad. The station had started to come apart behind me. The warehouse doors opened and slammed in the wind. A crack ran through the ice between the huts. Steam came up through it in white bursts. Casey was standing near the central platform with a small metal case in his hands. Where'd you get that? I asked. Refrigerated warehouse. I knew what was inside before he said it. The borehole won't collapse, he said. The seismic charges failed. The demolition team had already tried them. I hadn't heard the charges over the pulse, but I saw the result. The shaft was still open. The rigs remained standing around it, though one had sunk several feet into the broken ice. Casey opened the case and checked the controls. What is that? Nuclear demolition device. He said it without any special expression, like he was telling me the weather had changed. You're going to set it off here? Yes. How long? He faced the helicopter pad. Jimmy's helicopter was running with its lights on, rotors turning slow through the blowing snow. 1 minute. That's not enough time. It's the time we have. He closed the case and gave orders to the Marines. They moved toward the pad, carrying the injured and whatever equipment they could hold. I kept the hydrophone case against my chest and followed them. Casey stopped me. You carry those records? Yes. Then don't drop them. I wasn't planning to. He looked back at the drill floor. Black was still there beside the open borehole. He had the microphone cable in both hands and was watching the dark shaft. The rest of the platform had tilted beneath him, but he didn't seem to notice. Johnny, Casey called. Black didn't turn around. Casey took one step toward him and stopped when the ice cracked under his boot. The crack ran through the drill floor and widened toward the rig. "Johnny, move." Black kept looking down. There wasn't time to argue with him. There wasn't even time to hate him for staying. The floor dropped another few inches and the microphone cable pulled tight in his hands. I ran. The helicopter sat at the edge of the pad with the side door open. Jimmy was in the pilot's seat. He leaned out as I reached the aircraft. "Load them quickly," he said. "We have 1 minute." I put the hydrophone reels inside and climbed in after them. Cody was already on the floor with a bandage pressed against his head. His eyes were open, but he wasn't speaking. 2 Marines pulled the door shut behind me. Casey came aboard last. He carried the metal case and set it against the bulkhead. "Where's Black?" Jimmy asked. Casey strapped himself in. He stayed. Jimmy looked at him for half a second. Then he faced the controls. The helicopter lifted before the skids had fully cleared the pad. The station dropped away beneath us. The basin was no longer a basin. It was a widening black funnel filled with steaming water and broken ice. The huts went first. They slid toward the opening and disappeared into the dark. The warehouse followed, its doors still hanging open. The rigs tipped one after another and went down with their lights shining through the steam. Casey held the metal case between his knees and watched the ground. The charge went off beneath the station. There was no fire, just a hard white flash under the steam and a force that lifted the helicopter sideways. The black funnel folded inward. Rock collapsed around the borehole and drove the warm water back under the seabed. Then the sound went through every one of us. It wasn't a voice through the radio. It wasn't the pulse from the hydrophone. It was inside my head, too loud to be called a thought. The thing below us screamed as the cavity closed. Every man in the helicopter heard it. 2 of the survivors opened their mouths and couldn't make any sound at all. Jimmy kept flying. Casey held onto the case. Cody stared at the reels on the floor while blood ran down his cheek. The helicopter climbed through the whiteout while Station Kelvin disappeared into the black, steaming funnel below. It took almost 2 days to get back to the Yukon coast. The helicopter landed at a military station near the water, and we were taken off one at a time. I was still holding the case with the hydrophone reels when 2 men in winter gear came over and took it from me. They took Cody's papers too. I don't know what happened to the others. We got separated before anybody had time to ask. "Those are project records," one of the men said. "They're my readings. They're being transferred through approved channels." I told him I wanted them back. He said that decision was above his authority. I heard the official explanation then. Station Kelvin had been an ordinary geological survey station. There had been an ice collapse. The personnel losses were unfortunate but consistent with the hazards of the region. There had been no rival convoy, no warm cavity, no voice in the dark. Thelma was waiting inside the station building. She'd come in a wool coat and had both hands wrapped around a paper cup she wasn't drinking from. When she saw me, she put the cup down and came over fast enough that I thought she might run. She didn't say anything at first. She just put her arms around me. I held her. I'd promised Margaret I would come home. I had kept that promise, at least in the narrowest sense of the word. She pulled back and looked at my face. "Are you hurt?" "I'm all right." That's not what I asked. I told her I had some bruises and a cut on my hand. Nothing serious. The rest of it was harder to measure. We went home that evening. I didn't sleep much. The house was warm and quiet, but the quiet wasn't the same anymore. The furnace came on during the night and I got out of bed before I knew I was awake. I stood in the hall listening to the motor run through the walls. Thelma sat up behind me. "Wayne?" "It's nothing." She waited. I returned to bed, but I couldn't settle. Enclosed rooms bothered me after that. So did mechanical humming. If the refrigerator ran too long, I'd find myself standing in the kitchen with my hand on the counter, listening to it. Prolonged silence was worse. Silence gave me too much room to hear things that weren't there, or things that had been there. The military came by the next morning with documents for me to sign. They didn't threaten me. They didn't have to. The papers were laid out on our kitchen table, and the man who brought them explained that the wording was standard. The expedition had been a geological survey. Station Kelvin had never existed. The location was restricted under national security provisions. I read through the pages twice. Then I signed them. Thelma was in the next room making coffee. I could hear the spoon hit the inside of the cup. She didn't come in while the man was there. After he left, she looked at the papers and then looked at me. What was it really? It was a survey. She held my gaze. Wayne, I can't tell you the location. Why not? Because I promised. To who? I didn't answer. She went quiet after that. Thelma could ask a question 3 different ways if she thought I was avoiding it. When she stopped asking, that usually meant she'd already gotten the answer. I had promised Ricky I wouldn't write the location. I hadn't promised him I wouldn't write anything else. A few days later, I started reconstructing the readings. I used a plain notebook and kept it under a loose board in the closet. I didn't have the original numbers anymore, but I remembered more than I expected. The depth of the first borehole, the temperature changes on the way back up, the pulse interval, the point where the drill dropped into open space. Memory isn't as reliable as an instrument. I know that. I worked around it by writing down only what I was certain of and marking the rest as an estimate. The estimates still lined up. The warm cavity had been real. The Western convoy had drilled to the same depth. The drilling had drawn a response from under the ice. The station had been destroyed when the charge collapsed the cavity, but the collapse hadn't killed anything. It had buried the opening under rock. I couldn't stop thinking about it. If the cavity had sealed, the warmth should have stopped spreading. It didn't. Later seismic records showed smaller warm voids beneath the ice in lines that ran away from Kelvin. Some were close together. Some were farther apart. They weren't random pockets under the cap. They formed a pattern. I don't know what made the pattern. I don't know if the thing under Kelvin had been alone. The official report didn't mention any of it. It called the readings inconsistent and attributed the temperature changes to drilling friction. It said the station had been lost to an unstable ice shelf. The report dealt with the Western convoy by leaving it out. I kept my own account anyway. The years passed without making it easier. Every new set of Arctic data gave me another reason to open the notebook. The ice thinned a little more. The warm areas spread beneath it. Some of the records showed the heat moving toward the coast and toward open water. I watched the changes from our kitchen table. Thelma would sit across from me with her coffee while I read the reports. She knew I was still working on the station, though I never told her what I found. She never asked for the location again. Maybe she understood that the answer wouldn't help her. Maybe she knew I was keeping one promise by breaking another. One winter, she put her hand over the notebook. "You're not going back there, are you?" "No." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." That was true. I had no intention of going back. I didn't need to. Kelvin had already come home with me in enough ways. The last private record was written at night. The house was still. The furnace hadn't started and the refrigerator was quiet. Thelma sat in the other room and turned the pages of her book every so often. I could hear that small sound through the open door. I wrote down the final set of measurements. The ice above the buried cavities was continuing to thin. I wrote that the bomb had delayed the warm presence but hadn't stopped it moving. I didn't use the word entity. I wasn't sure it was the right word, and I didn't want to turn a measurement into a conclusion. The warmth was real. It was spreading. It was moving closer to open water. That was enough. I looked at the blank space beneath the last line. The location belonged there, or it didn't. I knew exactly where it was. I could still see the basin through the snow. I could still see the lights on the western side and the black water opening between us. I could still hear Black saying the cavity was the deposit. I left the location out. Thelma came to the doorway. "Are you finished?" "Almost." She nodded and returned to her chair. I read the page one more time. Then I closed the private record after writing that the thinning ice was carrying the buried warmth toward open water.